Hello, everyone, and welcome to MEI's 2022 Climate Week event. This is day 3 of the event. My name is Mohammed Mahmoud. I'm the director of the Climate and Water Program at the Middle East Institute. I'm very excited today on our third day of our event to host a panel where we will be discussing primarily issues related to disaster preparedness and how the region can adapt to extreme events. We have a really diverse and exciting panel to join us here today. I'll just briefly introduce them. Uba Jua is the manager of Climate Change Studies Division at the Royal Scientific Society based in Amman, Jordan. We also have Mohammed Ashake, who's a meteorologist, founder and CEO of Arabia Weather Incorporated. And then finally in our panel, we also have Aisha Suwaidi, who's a project manager in the UAE Ministry of Presidential Affairs. So welcome all. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a lot to cover as regards to this topic. A lot of it has been in the news lately. And so let me not waste time diving into our first discussion question. Which is related to what's been happening in the region related to this topic. And really wanted to start with what has been dominating the headlines, which has been all these dust storm activity that's been occurring over the last couple of months, affecting numerous countries in and around the Arabian Peninsula. This year's dust storms have truly ravaged the Middle East in unprecedented fashion during this recent period, more so than we've seen in recent time and history. We've seen impacts in Iraq, in Syria, even as far as Turkey. We've seen it move southwards in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, etc. With this level of activity of dust storm, what do you foresee as being a long-term consequence of future dust storm seasons like this on the region? And I'll maybe ask Aisha first, her viewpoint before we move around across the panel to see if others want to address the question. I'll also add before you respond, Aisha, we also have a Q&A aspect to this webinar. So if our audience is also interested to ask questions beyond the ones that I've prepared today or that we were planning to discuss today, please make sure to do it via the Q&A chat window and we'll be able to receive them and I'll be able to filter that to our panel. So Aisha, sorry, the first question, if you want to address that and then we can move it around the panel. I believe you're on mute, Aisha.
Sorry, so the dust storms in the region that's been affecting the whole region have been quite severe. They not only do they affect human health, but you can't they were so severe at one point that even driving, it was like you had this really, really thick fog. So there's environmental consequences and air quality consequences and health consequences for people. So these severe dust storms will also affect everything from tourism, from people enjoying their time, from their health, asthma. A lot of people who have asthma-related issues in these last series of dust storms got infections, got really sick, and had reoccurring infections. So not only could they not go out, they also fell ill. So you have people who can't go, like children who can't go to school, employees who can't go to work, so the productivity goes down. But we don't have these impacts that are indirect impacts measured. It's not only a quality of life or quality of the outdoors. There are indirect impacts that could have monetary, financial, health, and environmental consequences that might not be taken into account. I'm not a meteorologist or a scientist, so I'll let my colleagues who know better to add to my comments.
No, that's perfect. I think you I think your response is in line with what the common citizen is experiencing because of this. But you're right, it's perfect panel to answer this question, because I want to shift to Mohammed as a meteorologist. I am sure you have been tracking this very carefully, and whether you would have liked to or not, it's something that is unavoidable. So, what have you seen happening that you feel could be a long-term consequence of this level of dust storm activity?
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. It depends on your time. And generally speaking, this year has been, this season actually, there's been a severe season in terms of dust. But when we looked at the reasons behind that and what was different this year compared to the last years, we found some interesting facts. So first of all, this is not the first year we had such kind of dust storms. We had this before, but there's no clear or regular way or timing that this is happening. But if we look deeper into some of the reasons as well in the years that are similar to this one, we found out some similarities that are interesting. First of all, we've had a very dry season in the Arabian Peninsula this year. And that was very clear actually in the Iraqi areas as well in northern Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has experienced one of the driest seasons on record since long term or long years, and even the Eastern Mediterranean areas has been very dry in terms of dry season. This year, the winter was very cold, very dry, with less rain comparing to other and to previous years. So that's one of the reasons. Second reason is actually the political situation has an angle here. Is we've seen that some areas in eastern Syria and western Iraq, they have the lack of the farming activities, and we're talking about individual farming, not necessarily as well institutional farming, has played a very, very big role in this year dust storms, because the soil in that area is the soil moisture, first of all, is very low, it's below the average. And the second thing is actually there's no actually farming activity happening in compared to previous years. And both reasons together, along with some weather related as well, let's call it reasons, created that kind of high sequence or high volume of dust storms that happened this year. We've seen that happen in the past, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, but this year has been a remarkable year in terms of the amount and the type and the volume of dust storms, and we think that this was because of those two incidents. So it's a local, we could call it, it's a local reason, and there's a wide scale reason. The local reason is the lack of focus on farming and agriculture and the green initiatives in general in the region, and the other one is because of the dry season. Would we see this in the future? As long as the local one still there, which is the not focusing on the green initiatives and the farming, I think we will continue seeing such kind of dust storms. It could be up and down. It depends on the rainy season and whether it's going to be wet or dry. So that's my point of view on what's going on in the Middle East.
I think that sums it up exactly right. I agree wholeheartedly. There's a lot of drivers, as you said, both local and regional, that have caused this activity, this level of activity to occur. Oba, I'll shift to you, and maybe you want to talk about dust storms. I have a follow-up to that I want to ask you, but if you want to comment on this, I'll give you a chance to do so.
Hi, and thank you very much for having me. I'm proud to be with you. Related to dust storms, I have read lots of scientific articles related to climate change, and the science says that it is indirectly caused, climate change indirectly caused dust storms. As Mohammed said, it's that the drought all around us, the less precipitation all around us is causing much dust storms. So it's not directly related to climate change, but it is a byproduct of climate change. So this is according to what I have read a lot about.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's in terms of climate change, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's where we want to move next. Is we're seeing these impacts that are really a byproduct of this long-term effect of climate change in the region, and there's a number of impacts, both short-term and long-term, that the region experienced. And we just a touch point we're starting with is dust storms. But there's other short-term extreme weather type events occurring from climate change that have had impacts on the region, immediate impacts. Certainly dust storms, we've said. Tropical cyclones in the last last few years, certainly last year has gotten headlines with Cyclone Shaheen hitting the Arabian Peninsula. And then the other one that I think is important to mention is the wildfire. And I think we're moving into a significant season when we go into the summer where we're going to see these types of immediate impacts be more present. So really my question here is, starting with dust storms, but looking at all these other short-term extreme weather type events, in recent years, in what ways have you seen these types of extreme weather events affect and impact the MENA region? And maybe I'll pose this to you first, Mohammed, and then we can go around.
Sure, Mohammed. We've seen maybe the climate change is something that is wide to be defined, but we can confirm here in the researches that we have made in the center that there is an increase in what you call the severe weather events, whether you call it like cold waves, heat waves, or rain systems, or even hurricanes as I've seen in Oman. And there is a confirmed study that shows that Oman got more hurricanes and tropical activity in the last 10 years in comparison to what it got in the previous 90 years before that. So that's clear. My view on that is that there's a direct impact on property and as well lives in the Middle East. The way that I see how we can actually cooperate and coordinate on that, there's two approaches. So there's a proactive and reactive way. So the proactive way is actually we cannot just stand still against such a kind of weather events. So we have to invest more in early warning systems and decision support solutions that would help citizens, businesses to mitigate such kind of risks and to equip the governments and even the citizens with the right tools and technologies to protect themselves from such kind of weather events, whether are they dust storms or snowstorms or whatever you can call it in terms of severe weather. So that's the proactive approach that we have to focus on. In parallel, we have always to look at as well in the proactive scenario on going into some local initiatives. We're talking about the Saudi Arabia Green Initiative is one of those initiatives that we have to replicate in the region, and we have to completely sponsor such kind and support such kind of initiatives because it has a direct impact. And we've seen that there's a problem in the way that the citizens and even governments and businesses reacting to the severe weather events because we don't have an experience in that. We are very late. This is not a criticism. This is something that we've seen it. And I think we can react to that in the right way. And I think by time, more of those events are gonna happen. So we have to be prepared. There's a reactive way, which is policy making. But that thing is, I think, has an impact longer term, not in the short term.
Oba, what are your thoughts on this question?
I'd like to give you an example from our projects. We worked on a project that targeted Jordan Valley. In interacting with the farmers and the people on the ground, they stated that they have been seeing more and more extreme events, such as prolonged heat waves, frost in the northern regions. They have been experiencing drought. So they have been experiencing this more and more, not unlike the previous years. In Jordan, we have scarcity in water, and it's a known thing, and we are adapting to it. But the frequency of the events are happening more. We are facing currently something like shifting in the seasons, and this is impacting a lot the farmers. So I guess the impacts of climate change is localized, and we need to adapt and seek resilience in a localized manner. So each area within this Jordan Valley, north, middle, and south, each area has a specific adaptation or resilience plan that we need to implement and seek. In general, we need to work with the people on the ground to build their capacities and enhance their resilience. And as Muhammad said, we can work with the governments to have policies on ground, to have safety nets, to have things that can support people on the ground. So from a practical point of view, we need to work more on the people, on educating the people, on strengthening their resilience more and more.
Great. Those are great points. Aisha, I'll turn to you in this question. Maybe whether you've decided to do this or not, I'm volunteering you to be the first-hand view, at the community and citizen level. And speaking as someone who is physically in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula last year that has both experienced directly impacts of cyclones, extreme heat, not to say other impacts have affected Jordan with our other panelists, but from your perspective, especially this last year, where we saw these extreme record temperatures around the Arabian Peninsula, Cyclone Shaheen and other sort of cyclonic type activity, how, from your point of view, have you seen these short-term sort of extreme type weather events affect your part of the region?
We did talk about the effects of dust storm, but what I think is most important is to realize we have like localized consequences like the heat, the dust storms, but the fact that air, water, and nature connects us all. What happens in another region has consequences on the entire world. Every single part of this world is connected by the sea. It's connected by the air we breathe. Contaminant, pollution, extreme weather events, they don't know boundaries. They don't know that, oh, I'm going to stop here between Saudi or UAE or between Jordan. It's extremely connected. And what happens in one part of the world will affect another. So what does that tell us? That tells us we have to do a collective effort in order to combat climate change. And though we say climate change, for a lot of people, they don't know what climate change means. Is it just the weather changing? And what causes the climate change? There are so many factors with climate change. It's not just greenhouse gases. It's not industries only. It's not transport. It's not electricity companies and the built environment. It's so much more. It's the fact that a lot of the ground cover in the world, in Africa, in Southern America, all these forests have been removed. It's because also agriculture went from being nature-based, and people would take their livelihood from nature to having some monocrops that increased desertification. So you're seeing in some countries that had beautiful forests and healthy soils turn into sand. So now they're becoming marginal environments. Why? Because those forests were cut. Agriculture came in, ruined not all agriculture, but some of the agriculture had like bad agricultural practices and unsustainable agriculture practices turned viable ground into sand or desert, and that's what we call desertification. So in a layman's term, we're kind of turning the earth because of our practices and the way we're exposing it from a wonderful ecosystem to a desert ecosystem. The Arabian Peninsula at one point was green in the past. It had flowing rivers, according to our archaeologists, and now has changed. So we also don't understand the climate, the whole view of the climate change. But what needs to happen is the government, which I represent, and people like our scientists, Mohammed and Ruba, we need to connect the dots together. So they have the science, they have the meteorological information, we have to come together and create the solutions together by talking to each other, and we can't be siloed. I think that's the number one step. And there are solutions that we could work together on.
Fantastic. I mean, that's if there's no better rallying call in terms of the urgency to address this issue, and I agree. Certainly, anthropogenic effects, human effects, have certainly accelerated what could have occurred naturally, sort of natural shifts in the climate. But absolutely, I personally feel what's been happening in recent decades is certainly because of the human impact. So thanks for that. I want to, something that was sort of mentioned or hinted at in some of your comments earlier when we were talking about these, at least we'll still touch on these short sort of extreme type events. We'll talk about the longer term ones here in a minute, but how these types of short-term intense events have basically evolved over the recent years. Why do it seems that in this current period, there is more severity and frequency of these types of short-term extreme events. And I'll maybe ask you, Mohammed, as the meteorologist, to maybe add some insight on why we're seeing this evolution, or how have they evolved in terms of frequency intensity in this current period compared to the past.
As we said, maybe if we look at the tropical activity in general in the Arabian Sea, it's been happening in more frequent way than it used to be before. And that's more of like a reason of the patterns that we're experiencing in the oceans around the world, whether it's the Pacific Ocean or even the Indian Ocean. The type of oscillations, we call it, or phenomena that are happening there are happening in a way that is making the Northern Arabian Sea more active in terms of tropical activities, and that is yielding more into storms and tropical activities that are affecting Arabian Peninsula. Having said that, also we've been seeing as well another reason, which is the urbanization, the way that people are expanding their cities. It's been happening across different regions and different parts of the world in unplanned way towards more areas that are getting already severe weather. So we're seeing also, beside having the meteorological reasons where we're seeing some phenomena and oscillations are in favor of getting more regular weather events in the region, whether they are dust storms or even tropical activities or even prolonged cold waves we've seen in the last couple of years. That's one of the reasons. I cannot give a definite answer on what are the reasons, but we can see that it's part and connected part of a global circulations and global weather phenomena. But also we've seen that the unplanned urbanization and the expansion of some cities towards areas that already were known of having some more, it's quite exposed to weather events. We've seen that this is happening, and that was one of the causes that people are seeing more severe weather events and exposed to such kind of events, which at the end of the day yielding to more losses, whether in lives or in property. So either way, whether it's getting because of global changes in the circulations and oscillations, or because of unplanned expansion to cities to cope with such kind of increase in the population, we're seeing the same results. I think there should be a question, what is the solution to that and what are the solutions for that? I would say again, the handy solution is to be mitigating such kind of risk by as early as possible, planning in the right way. In the urban planning should adapt to the climate, let's call it changes and cycles, also equip the governments and the people with the right early warning systems to help them to mitigate such risks. I think that's something that is vital. We've been seeing a lot of talks globally about the policymaking and the way that how we can reduce the emissions and different type of actions that is related to the global scale of climate change causes. But I second Aisha when she said that we should come together, academic, private, and public sector, and try to figure out how we can make a framework or a platform that would help people to mitigate the risks of those kind of climate variabilities.
Yes, exactly. this almost perfectly syncs up to my follow-up question with that is, we've talked about these short-term, intense type events that even with advanced forecasting, meteorological forecasting, they still happen very quickly, right? And once we know they're going to happen, even with the forecasting, there is usually not a lot of time to prepare for them, right? When we think about the dust storms or even the heat waves or wildfires even. But when I think about maybe the longer, slower type of extreme events and impacts, I think exactly what all of you have said, Aisha brought forth, and Mohammed, you just added on, this idea of building sort of networks, collaborative networks. There is time, and it doesn't seem like a lot of time, but there is time to do things together to maybe prevent, mitigate against these longer type of impacts, because those longer term impacts actually could be more damaging in the long term because they're much more difficult to reverse versus extreme events that tend to pass after some amount of time. And what I mean, just to clue in our audience, these longer climate impacts that are, even though they're extreme, but they're not episodic or sudden like these extreme weather impacts events we've talked about recently. I'm basically referring to climate change implications like sea level rise, which is slowly progressing, but can have very serious consequences once reaching critical levels. Others that have been happening slowly and have worsening, the issue of water scarcity and drought. We mentioned that very briefly in some of your comments. But then also warming, right? Where we talked about extreme heat events in the peak of the summertime period. But generally overall, I think we've been seeing warming happen incrementally throughout the years because of just the climate change, more sun, more solar radiation being absorbed, the oceans, etc. The things that you mentioned, Hamad. So you've sort of begun to answer this question, but I'll ask it again just in case to cover it more comprehensively. Is these longer, slower moving impacts that are at the end probably more serious long term than these short impacts, which are also very serious and dangerous. How can we, as a region, prepare for these incrementally growing climate impacts versus these sudden ones, which we really can't prepare for the most part? You've talked about it generally and this idea of collaboration. But maybe let's if all of us can talk a little bit more about that, and maybe but we'll start with you, and then we'll move around the panel.
I guess for those kind of impacts, governments need long-term planning, and they need to have climate change streamlined within all strategies and policies. As we have been saying, that climate change is a cross-sectoral issue. Minister of Energy needs to deal with it. Minister of Agriculture needs to deal with it. Minister of Water. So we need the whole cabinet to have the climate change mainstreamed within our planning. So having a long-term strategy at the governmental level that has the vision or the involvement of all ministries, we need to have that. And it is not just for 2030, it needs to be more than that. It needs to be, for example, in 2050. So having a long-term plan will enable the countries to know how to be prepared for such events, for such negative impacts. And again, I say on all levels, we need also to work on the sub-national level with municipalities, also with people, agriculture on the farmers on the ground, with schools, with universities. So we need to be prepared. We need to know what to expect in terms of climate change projections on the long term, and we need to be prepared. So this is briefly.
Yeah. Aisha, you got us on this path, your comments earlier on solutions, but specifically now talking about these longer term impacts. what are practical ways really for the region to try to address these things that we're not necessarily going to see the net impact of them tomorrow, maybe next year, but I think once we do, it's truly can feel like a point of no return. If you wanted to add your thoughts on that.
So we're constantly talking about the problem, right? And I think most of us know that there is a problem. We experience it from all levels of community and society, whether we're public, private, citizens, whoever we are, youth, senior citizens, the entire community, because we're one connected world. So let's talk about the solutions. What is it that we can do? And there are solutions. For instance, just like we're humans and we get injured, but we can heal. Our body has a healing mechanism. So does Mother Earth and nature. Nature has amazing healing and recovery mechanisms, but we need to aid it. So when you were talking about sea level rise, who's the one that gets most affected by sea level rise is small island states that could disappear. But who has a role to play? We all have a role to play. So you need carbon sinks. I'm in the Arabian Peninsula. One thing that we could do is we could plant mangroves. Mangroves are amazing carbon sinks. They create amazing ecosystems. And when planting mangroves, we have to do it consciously, evidence-based, science-based. We don't just plant them randomly. We have to choose appropriate locations using zonings, and you have to understand this is an ecosystem that shouldn't encroach on other ecosystems. There's diversity in nature, and you have to respect that diversity. You have to understand it, and we have to provide nature-based solutions. So that's one way that a nature-based ocean carbon sink, also peatland. There are other carbon sinks. Working in countries where you can work on agriculture. Now there are institutions like we have an amazing institution here in the UAE. It's called the International Center of Biosaline Agriculture. So they actually work on marginal environments and on salt-tolerant plants. So since there is a problem around the world now, our groundwaters are becoming more saline. You need plants that can handle extreme weather, like heat waves, and they won't die. You need plants that are salt tolerant, but also drought tolerant. So even if there is an episode of drought, that plant is resilient enough to handle it. So the International Center of Biosaline Agriculture, ICBA, has worked on quinoa, and they've created varieties of quinoa through their studies and their research that has been successful. Quinoa is extremely nutritious, but these plains are salt and drought, and they're adapted to climates. So there are solutions out there. It's how to connect those solutions to the people and how to bring them. So you also need policymakers, you need sustainable finance mechanisms to encourage the small farmer, and to also take that knowledge to the government. And our role as a government is to spread that knowledge so we can give the earth a chance to, and we can ensure that people have food to eat. Because if tomorrow people hit a famine, it's not only going to be climate change problems and people dying, it's going to be political crises. It's going to be, and that have severe, you could have crises that erupt in wars in the region that could even have a more severe effect.
But you have your hand up. You wanna jump in? Thanks.
I want to echo what Aisha has said in terms of having scientifically based decisions all the time. We need the capacity building for the decision makers, by the way, for the farmers on the ground, for the population, the public at large. So for the solution to be really effective, we need capacity building. We need technical capacities. We need technology transfer. So there are solutions, as Aisha said, but they need the technical capacities and they need the financial resources to implement those. Because the impacts are being faster than the solutions being implemented. We need those to balance. And in case we couldn't have the effective solution, we need to adapt. And we need to raise the public or the citizens' resilience in that case.
I like some of the things you said. I like because I think it tackles this issue of how the region can be prepared long term. Is the top-down approach, which is this idea of creating policies and governance and regulations from a national or regional level to address some of these things. And then the bottom-up approach, which I think you started to scratch the surface of, Aisha, in terms of actual practical engineering solutions, and then also to support both the interface between science and technology to help facilitate governance, implementing good policies, and then actual on-the-ground based solutions. So I think that's a great way to shift to Muhammad, who I think sort of represents that area of interface, of feeding in, as someone who looks at forecasting and tools that help provide more information real time. Muhammad, is there anything else you want to add in terms of how your particular sector can help provide solutions for the region long term?
Of course, decision support solutions recently in the world have seen an increase in demand. And here we'll talk more about climate security. So the companies and even the government entities need to be more, we call it climate ready or climate security ready. Those would not happen through only just saying that we're a climate friendly company or we are a climate friendly entity, or we just put that as a statement on a website or something like that. It has to be really in terms of the core operation that they are ready in terms of climate changes and variability. And the types of the solutions are really endless, but it could be part of their procedures. It could be part of their processes. It could be something that they can use as software. It could be as well part of the 5G and the availability of delivering the weather information at the right time, at the right manner, or it could be as well part of the smart cities planning. So it's actually the climate security softwares, or we can call it solutions, should be part of every single planning. Climate security is impacting now as well other security sectors, such as military, drones, the ability of defending the borders. We've seen certain evidences and events here in this part of the world where some people would use escaping from border of a country to another using severe weather, where they wait a severe weather event to do so. So we're seeing that impact everywhere. And I think the private sector and the solutions provider has the ability, and they have the ability actually, such as us, to provide such kind of solutions. But what we're seeing missing, but it's decreasing over the time, is that the readiness of different sectors to absorb such kind of solutions and to have it part of their processes. We're seeing some pioneering examples, such as maybe the United Arab Emirates, and as well Saudi Arabia is getting in top of this and trying to find out how they can change the mentality and the processes across a nation level. But we're seeing also other countries still, they don't put such kind of a matter on top of the priority list, and they're more acting reactively to this threat actually in the region.
You bring up a good point that I kind of want to underline here, which is we've traditionally looked at climate change in a silo, to bring up something Aisha said earlier, which is we've been looking at it very scientifically in terms of an impact, net effects, but we haven't really talked about how it affects everything, right, in more detail. And one of the things you said that we've started to, I think we've started to in recent times to understand the connection of climate change with public health. Certainly when we talk about extreme heat, water and food security, and we'll have a discussion question on that a little bit later. But one of the areas that I think we haven't, and I think you just really brought it up, is climate change as a security threat, as a regional security threat, not just in terms of natural resources, food and water, public health, which all are very important, of course, but this idea that there is a security threat because of climate change. And the thing I think back to is what happened earlier this year when it was raised as a potential resolution in the UN Security Council and it got vetoed. But even though that was an unfortunate outcome, I think it brought attention to the fact that, wait a minute, beyond the natural resource impact, the public health, even engineering infrastructure, how extreme heat is affecting physical infrastructure, is the fact that it's also a security threat. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I don't think it is underlined or highlighted enough.
Yeah.
So my next question, we talked about all of these impacts related to climate change, broadly speaking. I wanted to ask this question to all of you, which is, using from your own perspective, your own expertise, your own area or sector or industry that you work on, which of all of these types of climate change impacts, and this is obviously in the context of the Middle East and North Africa, which of the ones we've talked about, or maybe some we haven't even talked about, truly concerns you the most? And why does it concern you the most? So maybe Oba, we'll start with you, and then we'll go around.
I guess in our region, the most pressing issue is the water scarcity and less precipitation causing water scarcity, and rise in temperature causing maybe more demand for energy and also certain types of agriculture. So the most pressing things that we are seeing on the ground is the less precipitation and the rise in temperature, and it is really affecting things on the ground. If we talk about the agriculture or the Jordan Valley, we are facing, as I said previously, a shift in the seasons, and that if the farmers did not know how to deal with it, then they will lose lots of the productivity, and they can lose a lot of their money and livelihoods. And also, if we talk about extreme weather events, it is affecting our streets, for example, our utilities. I've been working with the water utilities in Jordan to plan for climate risk management. And people at municipalities need to plan things based on projected climate risks. So they need, in the first place, to be more educated, more aware about the concepts of climate risk and how to assess their vulnerability and their utilities or business vulnerability. So I guess from our perspective in our region, water is at risk. We have a rise in temperature also. So those are the most pressing issues.
I think you picked the big one right away, and as you said, I saw Aisha smile, because I think maybe you were thinking the same thing. But what are your thoughts on this, Aisha?
I'm so glad Ruba brought this. I totally agree with her. I think we underestimate the value of water, because when we and we take water for granted, we think it's an endless source like air, like it's always going to be available. I don't think the people, the normal citizens, maybe the scientists understand it, and even the private sector and even the governmental or public sectors do not understand that the severity of water scarcity. So what's really alarming is I'm in a water scarce region, right? So if we can make water work here, we can make it work anywhere. But what's alarming is that in regions where they have a lot of rainfall, like in the UK, some areas in the UK are facing water scarcity. That's crazy. Why would a country that is extreme, that has a lot of rainfall, face water scarcity? And that's because we misuse and abuse water. And the water that we're receiving, we're not really paying for the correct amount or we're not valuing it correctly. Water needs to be central in all our planning, in all our thinking, and it can hit. And Ruba also brought up capacity building and education from the private sector all the way to the public sector. If we invest in the UAE, our country has an extremely water scarce and water stressed country with extreme weather. So we don't want to be planting water intensive plants. We want to be planting crops that are not water intensive and that actually have nutritional value, and they have low costs on us. So water is extremely important. Water is life, and it should be central to everything we do. So I totally agree with Rabah. She hit the big one. And sometimes when we talk about climate change and green economies, we forget water.
I just want to highlight something that the IPCC recent published report says that our region will be facing decrease in precipitation by 20%. So we are again will be facing more and more reduction in our precipitation.
It's hard to imagine a region which doesn't receive a lot of precipitation even getting 20% reduction. It just seems just very adverse. And Aisha, what you said was music to my ears as someone who comes from a long background in water resource management. I really appreciate your comments. Mohammed, you're in the forefront of this in terms of tracking these types of activities climate-wise. What concerns you the most?
Actually, I would just second some of the thoughts here, but I just want to highlight as well that we've seen some regions or areas in this part of the world is experiencing increase in precipitation. And that by itself is also another risk. And it's a risk because we are not prepared to that increased precipitation, whether it's harvesting that kind of rain or utilizing in that kind of amount of rain and precipitation, since we're very, very poor in terms of water resources. So I think there's another risk here that we should adapt or plan to both ways of climate change. So increasing the rain as well. We've seen that in Southwest Saudi Arabia. We've seen that in other parts of the Arab world where rain is increasing, not decreasing. We've seen that as well in Oman and other parts of the Arab world. It's something that it could be a light at the end of the tunnel for some of the countries in terms of water resources, but we have to plan and change the dams, planning the way that we harvest the water, because we're seeing the increase in rainfall in areas that are rural areas, not in the main areas. So in outside the cities and far away in the desert. So that's one of the things that I just wanted to highlight. But back to the main question, I think in terms of priorities or concerns, I think it just wherever weather events or climate change that is impacting food, water, or environment is concerning for us. So the climate change, at the end of the day, it's a change on a trend basis, not a single weather event that's called the climate change. So anything that is impacting the agriculture, the food, it's concerning. So it cannot be so if it's not. And anything that is actually impacting our environment and air quality is actually something that is concerning. We're seeing such kind of dust storms. We're seeing weather patterns that is causing more smog cases happening in some of the very populated cities. So that is something that for me is very concerning as well, because the air quality is dropping in certain areas. And that needs, by the way, if others would ask what we should do, is actually we have to implement more air quality sensors and try to think about that angle. And third one is actually water. Any weather event, whether it's heat waves or very dry waves, is impacting the water security as well as concerning. So everything is concerning. And I think all it comes in the first priority. But at the end of the day, it depends on how we can all come together and solve this problem.
It's almost like you're reading my mind, because I did want to ask about food and water security next. But one thing I just wanted to mention that you said that I think is difficult for maybe the layman or sort of the uninitiated in what's happening with climate change is this dichotomy of how can we be in drought in a region, but also suffer extreme precipitation and even flooding events in different areas, right? And I think that's the reality with climate change is it's the changes we're seeing are of extremes. It can be extremely dry, but still have periods of extreme precipitation and heavy storms. And you know, to your point, we've seen that in the region that's generally over the period has gotten warmer. But at the same time, you look at things that have happened, say, last year in the Nile River Basin, which has also been under drought, has suffered extreme flooding events during heavy precipitation periods. So both are possible, but it's sometimes hard to imagine that if you don't, folks don't have a better understanding of how climate is changing. What about you?
Yeah,
did you want to jump
exactly.
in or yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Ahmed.
No worries. I just want to say that the way that we look at the climate trends and the weather events is actually challenging because we could see, as you said, the opposites happening and odds happening together at the same time sometimes. So the way that how we can react to this is a bit challenging, and it needs great minds, which I'm sure we have it in the region, and we have new technologies that we have to utilize, AI and machine learning, and the hardware development, something very important to mitigate or to even sometimes to utilize such climate change trend. Maybe climate change could be positive in certain, maybe limited area, but it depends on how we react to that climate change that is happening.
Yeah.
We do have, it's challenging, as you said, having those changes, severe changes in climate. But those extreme events, the changing in rainfall patterns are so much disastrous than positive. And we are facing maybe increase in rainfall in areas that is deserts, and we can't make use of those water if we don't plan to have the right dams, as you said previously. So maybe this pattern is not so much useful because we have prolonged heat waves, drought, then we have like precipitation that is so much heavy, and we can't make use of this water for agriculture, and it is devastating on the other side. So we need a long-term plan. We need to be ready for preactively for those events, and we need to have infrastructure on the ground to invest in those adaptive measures so that we can make use of the positive side of, between two quotations, of the climate change.
I agree, and I think improving or utilizing or mainstreaming forecasting, things that Mohammed works on in terms of information and data, I think can help.
I'd like to give an example, if I may.
Yes.
We had this project, we worked on Jordan Valley, and we developed a database for farmers and targeting special areas, north, middle, and south. And we had the meteorological information getting into a platform, and through an application, as Mohammed said, we delivered the information on the climate change or the weather in due time, so that we can help farmers implement some measures to adapt to what extreme event can happen. So, for example, we can send a message for the northern part of the country that the farmers could expect flash floods now, so they can do something in order to protect our farms. For the north, we have been seeing more and more frost days, so we can warn the farmers in the north about having frost. So the information from the meteorological department or from the طقس العرب is very, very, very important in the first place in order to notify and warn farmers or people at the ground of the danger that is they are going to face. So it's very important. And number one thing within this project or this measure is to have the data provided from meteorological department and from the meteorological stations in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about food and water security. Mohammed brought it up in his comments and wanted to link that with how climate change is affecting that area. We've hinted at it in some of all of your comments earlier. But Aisha, let me shift to you because I think you have an interesting perspective as it relates to agriculture. And I want to kind of ask you sort of how, from your perspective, how the water and food security of the region is being affected by these various climate change impacts. And, maybe the direct ones, obviously, we mentioned drought as it relates to water scarcity. Maybe not the case in the Arabian Peninsula, but let's even maybe throw in wildfires. We've seen wildfire activity over the summers amplifying in the region, certainly around the Mediterranean band in North Africa and the Levant, portion of the Levant that is coastal. Can you share your perspective on that?
Like both my other colleague, panelists, Mohammed and Ruba, have clearly shown that meteorological data is extremely important in understanding what's happening. It's so you need to have, we've seen that the rainfall pattern around the world is shifting and changing. So having that data will help us create future scenarios and possibly forecast what those future changes will be. So which areas might face drought and which areas might have experienced heavier and more severe rainfall. So we've seen there is less precipitation maybe on an average, and there is maybe less rainfall, but what happens is that you get long periods of no rainfall and then sudden periods of extreme precipitation and extreme rainfall that could cause, as Ruba had said, flash flooding. So that's where the data comes in. In terms of the UAE, and I did want to tell you that in the UAE, we've got the National Meteorological Center, and they have amazing applications on tracking data, tracking the weather, if there are clouds coming, where the rainfall. So it's extremely forward-thinking and extremely advanced in weather modeling. We also have something as in the UAE we're all proud of is the UAE Rain Enhancement Program and the Cloud Seeding Program, which is looking into how you can seed clouds to have greater amounts of precipitation. In terms of food security, in the UAE, we're encouraging closed environmental agriculture because we can control that. So these are ag tech, so it's they're vertical systems or greenhouses, but it's more or less a closed, and it's not open field farming. But what works for us is works for our region and our weather are these closed environmental agriculture models, which may not be the right choice in other places in the world. In terms of, for instance, another example is dams. A lot of dams here were created. They might not be the most effective solution because there's not a lot of rainfall, but dams in other parts of the world could be the right solution. We're looking into for water security, aquifer solutions. So when it does rain, that rain is diverted back to the groundwater, which is very important to us. So those are just some examples of food and water security that are like specific to the UAE and our region.
Great. I think we can move, based on what you just said, I think we can move into our next question, which you've really answered here, which is when we look to the region, and yes, we tend to, unfortunately, when it comes to climate change, we tend to be blinded by the problems, right? We always talk about these bad things are happening, and unfortunately, we tend to lose a lot of people that way. But that's the reality. But and others have also begun to mention this. But one, what are good examples of solutions in place that are already existing in the region that you can think of or that you want to highlight that address some aspect of these climate change impacts problems, certainly for food and water security, maybe in public health, maybe in engineering, and some of you already mentioned some examples, but I just want to give the opportunity for everyone to share if they haven't had the chance to do so. But what are actually some good examples in place? I was also going to ask what are things we could do, but I think you've all sort of answered that question previously, and you've given some good ideas. But maybe we can highlight things that are already in place in the region that we can look towards and maybe even be proud of, that we're saying, hey, the region is doing something, maybe not as fast or not as aggressive. We said that earlier, but just to highlight that, maybe Oba, will start with you.
Again, I will talk about agriculture, maybe if it's my focus of work mainly. In Jordan, as you may know, we have scarcity in water. But we can really produce with so much little water. We use we treat the wastewater, and we have maybe 60% of our production is using non-conventional water. And we have also lots of great success stories using hydroponics, for example, innovative technology in order to make good production. We also currently seeing very nice projects on the ground, working with farmers in order to shift their seasons, when to plant, and how to deal with the idea that we have shifting in the rainy season. And also there's, like they call it field schools. They work with the farmers on the ground in order to educate them on climate change and how to deal with the negative impacts of climate change in all aspects. The supply chain, where to put their produce and where to market it, because this is very, very, very important in order to preserve their livelihoods and have better resilience for our farmers. If they are strong, they can adapt to the negative impacts. So this is in terms of food security.
Great. Hamid, are there examples? I know you've mentioned things on the technological side, AI, machine learning as opportunities, but maybe from your perspective, are there good applications already in place? And it could even be, from your perspective in terms of forecasting tools, models, technology. Is there anything that you feel we already have that we can build upon? That's a good example of trying to address this climate issue.
Sure. I think what I've seen in the region, there is many parts of the world as well. There is a lack of data and data sciences. And one of the good examples that we have done, that we have built a model that is relying on AI and ML, where we fill in the gaps, let's call it in that way. You know that weather and climate, in terms of a topic, it does not stop in borders, and we need data from all parts of the world. And 70% of Earth is water, and that is a challenge as well, because we don't have enough weather data and sensors in oceans and sea. And most of the sensors is happening and being implemented on the 30% left. And part of the 30% left on Earth is having either crisis or conflicts that is limiting the number of data shared. So we have to come up with a different type of way of knowing the actual data, and that was depending on different AI tools that we have developed here, and that we use it to better modeling the atmosphere in the future. At the end of the day, accuracy is very important in terms of predictability, whether it's a long term for months or seasons, or even for the short term for a few hours ahead or probably some days ahead. So we have patent in that in terms of AI and ML. And I think I second Aisha as well and said that the National Weather Services are having a very important role in developing a much more modern, much more modern ways of delivering weather information to either citizens and people. And I think part of that is what we're doing here, is that we help other national weather services in modernizing their ways of delivering weather information. I think both of those solutions are important. I mean, we have to focus as nations on data and AI and data sciences to get better data quality. And as well, we have to focus on the delivery itself and the way that we deliver such kind of information or securities. Also, we have developed things for industry specific, like for oil and gas, for energy now. You know that the region shifted towards the renewable energy big time, and we've been one of the leaders in the region. I mean, we as Arab nations being able to be leaders in the world in moving towards the renewable energy. And also solar and wind are impacted directly by the weather patterns, and it could be sometimes impacting as well the overall energy cycle, which includes as well food and security. And also developing such kind of industry-specific solutions are very important. The role of private sector, I guess, is very important in this equation. So yeah, I think the region is full of capacity, and I think we have to move to execution instead of only just putting policies and planning. And second, Aisha, what she said, that solutions has to be made, and we have all to come together to actually move ahead and faster than what's happening in the climate change.
I'm glad you took an optimistic way of saying that, because we're so used to talking about this in a very negative way. Aisha, you start to answer this question before I asked it, but is there any other example you want to include beyond what you've said of good applications, examples, strategies already in place in the region that addresses these type of climate impacts?
One of them, I did give you various different solutions that is specific to the UAE, but there are so many solutions out there. A lot of the solutions never get to the market because they don't have funding, or like, for instance, the researcher or the innovator doesn't know how to market it, or to get an investment, or to deploy it into the market in a way that's scalable, realistic, and feasible. So that's extremely important. So if we create centers, like Ruba had said, the farmer centers and these educational centers where we constantly update people and we constantly vet new technologies and we put it out there, we could create, there's a lot of new possible disruptive technologies, but we need to facilitate public and private partnerships. Every single technology, there's not one size that fits all. There's not one technology that will work everywhere. Every technology needs not only to be vetted, but it needs to be specific to each place and each situation. So knowledge capacity building is extremely important, not working in silos, being connected, speaking to each other, creating mechanisms that and funding systems where innovators can come and get access to those fundings and make a difference is extremely important.
But go ahead, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to add that, or summarize what my colleagues have been saying, that data is number one important in finding any solution. And then to have the capacity and the science behind every measure or every policy I take as a government. Then at a different level, working with the people on the ground. The partnership with the private sector is very important as well. Maybe we as Royal Scientific Society, we work with both the government and with the people on the ground. So we know very much well what is needed from both sides. We need from the government to have climate change streamlined again in each of their planning or each policy they do. The water strategy needs to have a planning based on climate change. Transport also needs to have planning based on climate change. All ministries, all institutions need to have a long-term planning, by the way, based on climate change. And on the ground, we need to work with people to empower them, even work with them to have their innovations, as Aisha said, commercialized, used on a large scale. So work should be on all levels, and it should be localized and regional and transboundary. So we need all to work, and we need to network, and we need to have it all communicated up and down and horizontally.
That's a good way of putting it. I'm going to move on to our final question. I lost track of time because I've been so engrossed in our conversation. I realize we're almost out of time, but I wanted to give each of you a chance to give some final closing thoughts. I mean, we've talked about the climate impacts affecting the region. We've talked about how they affect the region. We've talked about solutions, whether solutions that currently exist or solutions that could exist. If you had a sort of a very short final message that you want to share based on everything we talked about, just sort of as a takeaway message from everything we discussed, what would it be, basically? Mohammed, we'll start with you and then we'll go around.
Sure. I think science, collaboration, and PPP, public-private partnerships, along with the academic sector, is very essential moving forward. And some of the leaders in the world, they just named the climate change as the next pandemic. So we have to treat it more seriously in terms of policy making and reacting to such kind of event.
Excellent. Aisha, do you want to share some final thoughts?
I think if we see ourselves as, like Ruba said, as people who are connected, and we can just put all the pieces of the puzzle together and work together effectively and fast track change. We need to be change makers and change agents, and you need change agents on all levels. So you need change agents in government, in schools, in universities, research facilities, in the private sector. So I think if we put hand in hand and we work together and we learn from each other's experience by having that open dialogue, it's extremely important.
Fantastic. And what about the final last word?
Okay. The young generation is going to be affected the most, or they will be feeling the impacts of climate change the most. So we need to empower them. We need to involve them. We need to have them as part of the solution. The youth, and our region, MENA region, is having the highest percentage of youth. So we need to build on that and to empower them to have the right action, the right solution.
Thank you. All very, very excellent points, and I'm really grateful that you say it so I don't have to say it. So I really appreciate that. You've all raised some very excellent points. I wanted to thank you also very much. We're at the end of our time. Mohammed, Aisha, Oba, thank you so much for sharing your time and really talking at depth about this issue that it feels we can never talk enough about. But I think today we talked succinctly and really shared some very important critical points and takeaways. So I wanted to thank you also very, very much for your time. Really enjoyed our discussion today. With that, I'll just highlight that tomorrow is our last day of our week-long of events for Middle East Institute in 2022 Climate Week. Our last panel tomorrow will start at the same time as today's, which is 9 a.m. Eastern, U.S. Standard Time, U.S. time, which I know people are tuning in from across the world. So whatever that time is for you locally. And we'll be talking about the state of climate activism. with young, to Ruba's point, young leaders and voices from across the region that are actually shaping the climate agenda for the future for the region, and trying to be those agents of change that Aisha said in her comments, and really moving into some of these solutions, as Mohammed addressed as well. So please join us again tomorrow for our last day on that panel, and thank you all for attending today.
Thank you and best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.